Thanks, Neil.
Well, you know, Democrats are bailing, but Nancy ain't exactly bending.
At the end of the day, the extension of the Obama middle-income tax cuts will take place.
The Obama middle-income tax cuts. I thought they started on the other guy. Anyway, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi standing firm against extending those tax cuts for the rich. Kristen Dorsey from the Economic Policy Institute says she is right. But Kristen, I mean, by the way, what is this new thing, the Obama middle-class tax cuts? I thought, say what you will of George Bush and how evil he was and all that, but I thought they started with him.
You're right, Neil, and while I disagree with Speaker Pelosi on that, she's right on the substance. Economically, the right thing to do is to extend them for the middle class, but to, as President Obama advises, allow them to expire on the wealthiest 3% of the population.
What's your gut tell you, though, Kristen, where this is falling out here, that the growing number of Democrats in the House, 32 by last count, who are saying many of them want to see taxes hiked on the rich eventually, just not now. Where do you think all of that's going?
Well, you know, I agree with your previous speaker that it's likely to end up with some sort of a compromise where we see a modest extension of all tax cuts for at least a couple of years. But, you know, let's face it. Realistically, that means, you know, you're just going to make these tax cuts permanent. If the economic argument is so compelling now as to not extending them, what's going to be different in 2 years? Not really much. So if Congress just...
Well, isn't the argument that they have that even those who don't flip over giving any tax relief to the rich, that in 2 years, you hope, will be better off and the economy better able to absorb that?
Well, that's one argument, but at the same time, you know, repealing and rolling back tax cuts at any point in time is difficult politically because you're telling people, I want you to do more. And even if economic conditions are better in 2 years, as we certainly expect, it doesn't mean that politicians are going to be willing to have that conversation with voters. You know, right now, the expiration of the tax cuts will only affect a very small portion of the population, as the president proposes, and it's a portion of the population that can well afford the modest increases that would be put into effect. And if you can't have Kristen, that conversation now, how can you have it in 2 years?
Good point, but it's not exactly modest, right? You're telling these people not only will they see about a 5% hike in their tax at the top end and the rate below that another few percentage points on top of that, but everything from capital gains to dividends to a host of business-related taxes, they're all going to go up at the same time. So it's not as if this is just going to be something that could just sort of wipe off their shoulder, right?
Well, it's certainly not going to be much more than that. You know, remember, we're talking about no tax increases at all until you hit people who, on an income side, are making 5 times what the median American household is. And by any measure, you're a well-off person at that level. So an increased tax burden, given that you've enjoyed tax cuts of huge levels over the past 9 years, is certainly not too much to ask, particularly
well, you know,
when
you and I can get into a debate about whether
this
this is right or wrong or populist or not. I could tell you that the rich still pay the most taxes. The percentage of the tax pie has only grown since the tax cuts. But I'm not going to do that. What I want to focus on in these final, 90 seconds or so is your sense of the weird position Democrats find themselves. Someone must have sort of gotten a hold of them and said, they're losing on this. They're losing on this whole issue. They're known more for spending than anything else. And that bugs them.
Well, you know, it does, but that's where the economist in me, Neil, gets really troubled, because extending tax cuts is spending as well. It's massive spending. Just on the upper 3% that we're talking about, that's $700 billion over a decade. We can call it tax cuts, but it functions the same way as spending.
Well,
so
you argue that you get a little bit more bang for the buck giving folks their money back of any persuasion than just spending it on programs and initiatives that have yet to bear anything remotely bearing fruit.
Well, that's not exactly true. You get more bang for the buck if you spend wisely on ways that stimulate
But I think you'd admit that we haven't, right, Kristen?
Creation.
I mean, look at the economy. Look what's going on. I mean, we haven't. You could talk about jobs created or saved, but the needle really hasn't moved, has it?
Well, it hasn't moved as much as I would like, but it's not fair to say that it hasn't moved at all. And any objective analysis, not just by my outfit, Neil, but from others, tells you that tax cuts provides the least bang for your buck than other proven ways of stimulating the economy. So if
Did
you're
the
asking
entire
me,
Reagan experience and the boom and the bull market that ensued in the 80s, is any of that ring a bell?
you know, it does, but I look at recent experience in the 2001 to 2007, a business cycle where these tax cuts were instituted, and we had record low levels of economic growth and employment and national investment.
Well,
You
we
don't need to
also
go
had
to
a
the 80s.
NASDAQ market crash, right? We also had this little thing called 9/11, but none of that rings a bell.
It all rings a bell, but I'm talking about the last recovery where we had these tax cuts in place, and it didn't work.
All right. Well, we could argue till the cows come home, but we're not going to do that.
But
Christian,
hopefully we can another time.
we will. You can count on it. Very good seeing you. Christian Dorsey in Washington.